Welcome friends to the series which we are doing on issues in world history, the 20th century. And in the earlier lectures on the rise of Nazism and Fascism, we talked about the various aspects which were associated with both Mussolini as well as Hitler. We talked about the conditions of Italy as well as Germany and how Hitler played an important role in terms of bringing about the kind of changes which we see in the Nazi regime. And we talked about the kind of propaganda in which the Nazis they indulged themselves and the idea of the totalitarian state, where we find that all sorts of opposition to the Nazi party was crushed by Gestapo and other bodies which were being created by the Nazi party. And we also see that individual liberty was not being given, and Hitler emerged as Führer or dictator. And we also talked about the idea of nihilism which was there in the Nazi philosophy and how Germany was trying to rearm itself, where we find that guns not butter became some kind of a slogan. They also emphasized on conscription at that point of time, in the policy of anti-Semitism could also be seen, where we find the Germans they were trying to see themselves as a pure race, and others they were being rejected on various grounds. Others they were not seen to be of the pure blood, and the kind of conditioning which could be done through the usage of the schools, and how people or young children they were being indoctrinated at a very young age. We also see some kind of a recovery in 1930s because of the 4-year plans and the policies which were followed by Hitler, and we also find when the industries they got revived, employment opportunities they were being given to so many workers, and because of which we find that how when employment was given, better wages they were being given, the workers lost their liberty and freedom as well because they were being taken over by the Nazi party, and all sorts of unionism was also lost because of this, and how we find that during this time the persecution of the Jews also takes place. So we find that how Germany under the tutelage of Hitler believed in the idea of the military policy of Hitler, which was based on the idea of expansionism. And we also see the, as we talked about, the conscription was an important factor at that point of time. And when you talk about the military policy, we find that the militarization of Rhineland takes place in 1936, and the annexation of Austria in 1938, of Czechoslovakia in 1939, and the beginning of the Second World War by the invasion of Poland in September 1939. So we find that the series of events which were there, and Hitler's expansionist military policy was evident in all these kinds of events which were happening at that point of time. So 1930s was a period when Hitler assumes power. After that he was trying to restructure the system which was there in Germany, and how he was trying to go for such kind of activities where more and more areas they were being annexed by him. And we find that how after when the Second World War began, after that he was through the policy of blitzkrieg or war with the lightning speed, he was able to crush his opponents in no time. During the initial period of the war, it was seen to be some sort of a Hitler's war where he was achieving victory after victory. And we find that how France was vanquished in 1940s, and how Nazis while in the possession of the large parts of Europe, they attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941 and declared war on USA in December 1941. So we find that how Hitler opened two fronts for himself, and that was seen to be one of the major mistakes of Hitler when he attacked Soviet Union, and how it was a long drawn war. Hitler believed that some kind of a war which will be a short war through his tactics of blitzkrieg, where he will eventually be successful, but that actually did not happen in the kind of weather which was there in Russia, and the dwindling resources of the Germans over a period of time So, that was one of the seen to be one of the most important or costliest mistakes which was made by Hitler. And Germany also wanted to be seen as some sort of a world power. So, we find that they also declared war on USA in 1941. And when you talk about the influences, we talk about that how teachings of Nietzsche and Hegel and Rosenberg, they were central to the ideas of the Nazis. And when you Hegel talked about the ideas of extreme militarism and narrow nationalism, and Nietzsche's nihilism rejected the Western idea of morality and dignity of men. So, all these kinds of ideas, they were central to the Nazi philosophy. And we find that how through their ruthless attack on the opponents, they were able to secure what they wanted to achieve. And we also see that how they wanted to repudiate and abrogate the hated Treaty of Versailles and Saint Germain. And Hitler in a way did away with many of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, where he rejected or did not follow what was being imposed in that treaty. And he also believed that how the German colonies which were there, they should be restored to Germany, and so that German people, they live in those areas, and the surplus population of Germany could be accommodated in these regions. And we see that when you talk about the Nazi party, when you talk about the Nazi regime, that how this kind of a regime was talking about a strong central authority in the national army, that the center should be should be strong, and the center should be able to take decisions, all sorts of decisions with regard to the kind of policies which were to be followed at the domestic as well as at the foreign level. So, we find that this kind of emphasis on a strong state was an important component, and how all sorts of unearned incomes, they were to be abolished. And we find when unearned incomes, they were to be abolished, then the property sections, initially they talk about that all the socialist ideals, they were being talked about, but in the later part we find that they were at the same time taking support of the capitalist elements as well. And when you talk about the Nazi party, we find that how the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was the official name of the Hitler's party, how accurate was it? The question is being raised whether it had the socialist elements or not, whether it belonged, or its elements which were referring to workers' movement, whether it contained those elements. So, we find that from the theoretical point of view, the 25-point program which was formulated by Hitler in 1920, it had both the principles of nationalist as well as the socialist ideals. So, such kind of principles one can see in the 25-point program which was formulated in 1920. So, that was one aspect which was there. And when you talk about the various kinds of principles which are there in the 25-point program, that how article 1 talks about the former predominated demanding the union of all Germans in a greater Germany. So, they talk about that how all Germans, they have to unite in one Germany, and how the treaties of Versailles and Saint Germains, they were to be the revocation of these treaties in article 2. And article 3 talks about the acquisition of the land and territory to feed the people and settle the surplus population which was there in Germany. When you talk about the other articles which were part of the 25-point program which was initiated by Hitler, we find that they were talking about how the Roman law was to be replaced by the German law with in the article 19, and they were also talking in the framework of a people's army, that how it was to be created through article 22, and a strong central state power was to be established through article 25. So, these were the articles which were there in the 25-point program, so that masses get in a way enamored or our masses get fascinated with the ideals of the Nazi regime. And we also see that apart from that, the nationalist component was also there, and this nationalist component was given further emphasis by a strong racial slant as well. Jews were to be excluded from the German nationhood, as Article 4 talks about, and which was evident in the anti-Semitic policy which was followed by Hitler. And all non-German immigration must be prevented, Article 8 says. So we find that Germany, or in the leadership or under the leadership of Hitler, was talking in the framework of excluding the Jews, because they were not to be seen as part of the German nationhood. And he also believed that all sorts of non-German immigration which was there, it must not be there now, it must be prevented, and the racial purity of the Aryan race was to be managed as well. We see that how, when you talk about the treatment which was meted out to the people, those who were not belonging or those who were not of the German stock or the German race. So these were the people, those who were the non-Germans, and how they should not have any kind of influence within the national media, what the Article 23 talked about. And then there were other articles like socialist element was apparent, mainly in the emphasis on the physical or the mental work, which the Article 10 talked about, and the abolition of the incomes which were unearned by work, which the Article 11 conveyed, and the confiscation of the war profits, as the Article 12 talked about. So we find that all these kinds of things which were there, all these kinds of ideas which were there in the various promises which were to be fulfilled later, as Hitler talked about, we find that some kind of a thrust was given to the nationalist and the socialist elements, and his ideas, they in a way catered to both these elements. And he also talks about the nationalization of businesses. So in Article 13, so we find that there was to be some kind of a thrust to the nationalization of the industries and the businesses, and how the profits, they were to be shared in the large industrial enterprises, was talked about in Article 14. And he also talks about the extension of the old age insurance in Article 15, and the idea of land reform in Article 17. So we find that all these kinds of articles, they were talking about that how the masses, they will be part of the German restoration, the kind of pride which Germany had lost, but at the same time how they will be treated equally as well, because many of the aspects which demanded some kind of attention, they were being given in terms of various articles by Hitler, because he was talking in the framework of the profit sharing in the industrial enterprises, and because of this he would be able to secure a lot of support from the working class, because the share will definitely go to them. And when you talk about land reform, then the agricultural sector, the people, those who were landless, the people, those who had very little land, they will be able to secure that kind of land for themselves. So land reform was an important component, and when these kinds of ideas, they were being preached through the 25-point program, so that masses get attracted to the policies and program of the Nazi party. And over a period of time, we find that Hitler was not particularly committed to the socialist element of the party program, and the German Workers' Party was to some extent a misnomer, as has been argued by some scholars, because Hitler aimed at creating a broadly classless movement which would at the same time appeal to the middle class as well. So Hitler talks about some kind of a classless movement where other classes, they are going to support him, where we find that he also made an appeal to the middle class as well. And we find that this kind of policy, where the maintenance and the creation of a healthy middle class was also the purpose of Article 16, and certainly became the basis of Hitler's electoral strategy after 1925. And we find that there were Nazis also who emphasized the socialist element of their ideology, but these did not include Hitler. In fact, some like the Strasses, they came in serious confrontation with Hitler over the latter's refusal to take socialism seriously. Instead, Hitler focused more and more on the racial rather than economic explanations for major historical trends. So, we find that how racial purity was an important component of Hitler's ideology, and he believed that the men of the German stock, they would be pure, and the others, those who are impure, they are creating that kind of a decadence in the German society. And this he also conveys in his work, as we talked about Mein Kampf for My Struggle, which was his autobiography, which got published in 1925, where he says that the adulteration of the blood and racial deterioration conditioned thereby are the only causes that account for the decline of the ancient civilizations, for it is never by war that nations are ruined, but by the loss of their powers of the resistance, which are exclusively a characteristic of pure racial blood. So, Hitler was talking in that framework that how civilizations they are getting diminished, how civilizations they are getting destroyed, but he attributes that the decline of the civilization could be seen in the framework of the decline of that particular race. So, an important component was having a race which was a pure race earlier, but that pure race was not a pure race now because of the contamination which had happened over a period of time. So, Hitler talks about these kinds of ideas, that how the pure races they will be able to safeguard themselves, how pure races they will in a way continue to provide that kind of a thrust where civilizations will flourish. So, when you talk about the historians, those who have in a way tried to assess Hitler's ideas or Hitler's activities, some of the scholars are Hitler centric, and that how Hitler was the main force behind every activity, and his ideas which shaped the historical events. And there were others, those who in a way maintained that Nazism was merely a branch of fascism, a general trend which reflected the problems throughout the continent during a particular phase of European history. So, we find that there are two schools like intentionalist and structuralist, those who are there, those who are trying to assess Hitler in terms of what Hitler was doing, what were his intentions, whether he was able to realize what he wanted to do at that point of time. And when you talk about the structuralism, we find that it had a variety of approaches, and the longest established is the Marxist view of Nazism as one of the manifestations of a general crisis of capitalism. And we see that the East German historians, they maintained that Hitler was a tool of big business, and non-Marxist historians, they acknowledged an economic influence, but placed this within a broader context of national and international influences. And we find that how some of the sections of the German population, they were vulnerable for economic reasons which had their roots in the 19th century. The middle classes experienced a crisis of industrialization which they made them susceptible to the radical ideas. And all these had a long history in the form of pan-Germanism and anti-Semitism, and in the quest for Lebensraum or the living space. And we find that these kinds of ideas, whether Lebensraum or the living space, which Hitler talks about, or Anschluss, which was the in a way amalgamation with Austria. So, Hitler was trying to follow those kinds of ideas, those kinds of policies which were in a way beneficial to the Germans, and for that he was ready to propagate his ideas. And when you talk about the Reich, which was from 1871 to 1918, these ideas had been confined to the fringe, but within the crisis of Germany's experience between the wars, they became the focal point. And we find that all these ideas, they were not new, but Nazism was particularly effective in an eclectic sense in combining the snippets of ideas and dogmas of salvation, which could be used as a deliberate simplification of political worldviews. So, in that sense also we find that how structuralism in a way also emphasizes that Nazism was part of the fascist mainstream, and the kind of roots which were there, they were a widespread disillusionment with the modernism and rationalism, and the emphasis on a curiously twisted form of romanticism. So, we find that all sorts of ideological undercurrents, they were also there at that point of time, and how they were also providing some kind of ideas to Nazism as well, and how we find Nazism was in a way a kind of a philosophy or an idea which was part of the fascist mainstream. But at the same time you also have to realize that when you are trying to see Nazism, then we see that you cannot separate Nazism from any kind of a movement. Even if we say fascist, Mussolini can be separated in that sense from the fascist movement, but Hitler cannot be separated from the Nazi movement at all, because the way Hitler functioned, Nazism was closely associated with him. And we also see that how fascists, they talked about the threat of the communist and the socialist parties, that how they will usurp power, how the capitalist elements, they will lose their prominence, and we will find that the communist elements they are in a way going to rule. And he drew upon a number of socialist ideas which had been modified to appeal to the middle classes. So, he in a way modified his thinking, his ideas, and how the socialist ideals, they can be modified to appeal to the socialist as well as the middle classes. So, we find that when you talk about fascism, how it was militaristic in nature, and apart from being militaristic, it was expansionist as well. It was talking about some kind of centralism within the state, and we find that how the fascist parties, they were depending on the cult of a father figure and developed mass movements to energize the masses with enthusiasm and commitment. So, we find that scholars, they have tried to assess Nazism as a philosophical idea, and how National Socialism, according to Bozat, was rooted in a combination of the general European crisis and Germany's national history and its peculiar divergence from the West. And when you talk about other school, intentionalists, they provide some kind of a stress on the unique importance of Hitler as the creator of the Nazi program and ideology, and how his ideas, most of them, they were confined, or they were contained in two books, Mein Kampf and Jutas Buck, which was the second book, both of them being written by Hitler. And we find scholars like Trevor Roper, they emphasize Hitler's own vital influence in the whole process of Nazism, about that despot too, who has often been represented as a tool, but whose personal power was so undisputed that he wrote to the end above the chaos he had created and concealed its true nature. So, we find that Trevor Roper in a way emphasizes the Hitler's own vital influence in the whole process of Nazism, and scholars like Bullock also accentuates the personal influence of the leader or the Führer, Hitler, in that sense. And Adman also goes further, and when he says that Hitler's greatness was diabolical, it was that of a world figure who confused the minds of men. So, these were some of the ideas which were being given by the intentionalist scholars, those who were trying to see that how Hitler was a dominant figure and how the principle of Führer was central to it. And this kind of a cult of leadership is to be found in all the fascist movement, we find, and it was very, very important to the Nazi context and ideas as well, because his ideas were very important, or rather crucial, in defining the nature of Nazi eclecticism. And as we see that how one cannot separate Hitlerism from Nazism, and how Hitler was able to provide Nazism with a unique vision of racial purity and anti-Semitism, which were not there in Italy. And so when you talk about both the theories, both the approaches, we find that there obviously there are deficiencies in structuralism, and the Marxist approach to Nazism as capitalism in crisis does not explain why some countries remain democracies despite experiencing similar kinds of problem. And capitalism was equally capable of assuming the democratic forms as well. So, but at the same time we should not write off structuralism in that sense, because the popularity of Hitler is impossible to explain without the existence of a strong degree of receptivity within Germany, and this could well be set in a wider European context. So, we find that how Hitler's ideas, they were more radical, and they were working on the needs of the population of that time. And so in that sense, structuralism is essential to explain the extent of this appeal, but cannot cover the way in which the attraction was presented. So this was very much within the scope of intentionalism. And when you talk about the foreign policy of Hitler, we find that scholars like Trevor Roper have argued that Hitler had plans which were unmistakably stated in Mein Kampf, and we have a lot of evidence which shows that Hitler wanted to carry them out. So Mein Kampf is generally seen to be some kind of a blueprint of his intended achievements, as has been argued, the way he conducted his foreign policy. And we find that Jutes Buck, which was the second book which was written by Hitler, it was written in 1928, and it also provided a foreign policy program in 5 stages. And these 5 stages, whether in the framework of the removal of the restrictions of Versailles, demilitarization of the Rhineland, so all this was also evident in the policies of Hitler, where he engaged himself in the where we find that he wanted to end the French system of alliances in Eastern Europe, and how Germany's control was to be established. And third, he wanted to defeat France, which he eventually did, and invasion of Russia was the fourth, and the fifth was the contest for the world supremacy against Britain and USA. So we find that there was a lot of documentary evidence, and how Hitler moved also in that way. Jekyll talks about that. There is ample documentary evidence to prove that he always kept his program in mind. So this kind of a close parallel could be seen, where we see that all the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, they were being negated, and how over a period of time he was able to settle for his ideas which were there in Mein Kampf. And A.J.P. Taylor has argued that Hitler was an opportunist, and he did not make plans for the world conquest or anything else, and he believed that others would provide opportunities and that he would seize them. So these are the kind of ideas which have been given by Taylor, and many times his ideas were daydreaming, but the way Hitler seized those opportunities, he was able to establish his authority. So we find that how Nazism had a great kind of an imprint on Nazism had a great imprint of Hitler's personality, and it could not be separated from the ideas of Hitler. Thank you very much.